In the year 525 BCE, an army of 50,000 men walked into the Egyptian desert. They were not refugees or explorers or pilgrims. They were professional soldiers of the Persian Empire, supplied by the most powerful state the world had ever known. They carried weapons, provisions, and the authority of a king who believed the gods themselves favored him. None of them ever returned. There were no survivors to tell the story, no bodies recovered, no graves discovered, no weapons found scattered across the sands. Only silence and a single ancient account written decades later, an account that raises as many questions as it answers. This is the mystery of the lost army of Cambyses II. At the height of the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Persian Empire dominated much of the known world. Its territory stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west. Cities that had once been proud, independent kingdoms now paid tribute to Persia. Lydia had fallen. Babylon had been taken without a fight. Media had been absorbed. At the center of this empire stood Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had built the empire through a combination of military brilliance and political restraint. Cambyses inherited not only his father's throne, but his ambition to rule all lands worth ruling. Soon after ascending to power, Cambyses turned his attention toward Egypt. Egypt was more than a strategic target. It was ancient, wealthy, and symbolic. To conquer Egypt was to place oneself in the lineage of pharaohs, to rule the oldest civilization on earth. In 525 BCE, Cambyses led a massive invasion westward and defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. With that victory, Egypt fell under Persian control. But conquest was not enough. Ancient sources describe Cambyses as increasingly hostile toward Egyptian traditions. He is said to have mocked their gods, violated sacred spaces, and ruled with open contempt for local customs. Whether these accounts are exaggerated by hostile Greek writers is still debated, but one thing is clear: Cambyses did not see Egyptian religion as something to accommodate. One religious institution in particular troubled him. Deep in Egypt's western desert lay the Oracle of Amen at Siwa Oasis. The oracle was revered throughout the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs consulted it. Foreign rulers feared it. Its pronouncements were believed to carry divine authority. According to later accounts, the oracle refused to acknowledge Cambyses as the rightful ruler of Egypt. For a king who claimed legitimacy through conquest and divine favor, this was an unacceptable challenge. Cambyses ordered the oracle destroyed. He dispatched a large detachment of his army westward from Thebes into the desert, with orders to reach Siwa Oasis and silence it forever. Ancient sources give the number of soldiers as 50,000. This was not a small scouting force. It was not symbolic. It was a full military expedition sent into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The western desert of Egypt is unforgiving. Vast stretches of sand and rock extend for hundreds of kilometers. Water sources are scarce. Temperatures are extreme. Navigation is difficult even for those familiar with the terrain. An army of this size would have required careful planning, water caches, supply lines, experienced guides, advanced knowledge of desert routes, yet there are no surviving Persian records describing these preparations, no logistical accounts, no official acknowledgement that the expedition ever occurred. The only detailed version of events comes from a Greek historian writing decades later. His name was Herodotus. Herodotus traveled widely and collected stories from the people he encountered. He recorded what he was told by Egyptian priests, merchants, and locals. His work is invaluable, but it is also deeply problematic. He often repeated stories without verification, blending fact, rumor, and interpretation into a single narrative. According to Herodotus, the Persian army marched for several days into the desert. They reached an oasis and rested. Then they continued westward. At some point beyond that oasis, a massive sandstorm descended upon them. The wind rose, the sands shifted, and the army was buried alive beneath towering dunes. 50,000 men, erased in a single natural catastrophe. It is a powerful image. It is also one that modern historians find difficult to accept. Sandstorms, even severe ones, do not behave the way this story suggests. They do not bury entire armies intact. They scatter equipment. They expose remains over time. They do not permanently erase all physical evidence of human presence. Despite more than a century of exploration, no mass burial site has ever been conclusively linked to the lost Persian army. No concentration of weapons, no armor, no bones, nothing that would indicate the sudden death of tens of thousands of soldiers in one place. There are also problems with the route itself. Herodotus' description is vague and inconsistent. The distances he describes do not align cleanly with known desert paths. Some of the oases he mentions may not have existed at the time, or may have been misunderstood by later readers. All of this raises a troubling question. If the army was not swallowed by the desert in a single moment, what actually happened to it? There is another possibility, one that receives far less attention than the dramatic sandstorm story. What if the army was not lost but destroyed? The Western Desert was not empty. It was home to tribes who resented Persian rule and were familiar with the terrain in ways no invading army could be. Ambush was possible. Supply lines could be cut. Guides could betray their employers. An army marching deep into hostile territory would have been vulnerable, especially if it relied on local cooperation. Egypt itself was unstable after the Persian conquest. Rebellions were common. Loyalty was uncertain. A large Persian force disappearing due to human action rather than nature would have been an embarrassment of enormous proportions. An army lost to the desert is tragic. An army annihilated by enemies is a political disaster. If such a defeat occurred, later rulers may have had every reason to reshape the story, to turn a military failure into an unavoidable act of nature, to let the desert, rather than human resistance, take the blame. 50,000 men marched westward under orders from their king. They vanished, and whatever truly happened to them may have been buried not only beneath sand, but beneath history itself. For centuries the story ended there, an army swallowed by the desert, a warning about arrogance, a king punished by nature itself. But deserts do not erase evidence easily, they preserve it. And that is where the mystery deepens. Modern understanding of desert environments makes Herodotus' account increasingly difficult to accept. Even in the harshest sandstorms, total burial on the scale described would be temporary. Winds shift, dunes migrate. What is covered today is exposed tomorrow. Over decades and certainly over centuries, something should surface. Metal corrodes slowly in dry climates. Bones endure. Arrowheads, spear points, fragments of armor, these things remain. Yet nothing definitive has ever been found. This absence is not proof, but it is a problem. To understand why, it helps to look at what moving an army through this region would actually have involved. 50,000 soldiers would have consumed enormous quantities of water every day. Even with rationing, the army would have required reliable access to wells or oases at regular intervals. The march would have been slow, deliberate, and dependent on guides who knew the desert intimately. This was not unknown territory. The Egyptians had used desert routes for trade and communication for centuries. There were established paths connecting oases, and knowledge of these routes was guarded closely. Control of water meant control of movement. If the Persian army depended on local guides, it also depended on their loyalty. And loyalty in newly conquered Egypt was far from guaranteed. Persian rule was recent. Cambyses' authority was not universally accepted. Resistance simmered beneath the surface. In this environment, betrayal was not only possible, it was likely. An army moving far from its base, through narrow corridors of survivable terrain, would have been vulnerable in ways that do not appear on maps. A single poisoned well, a delayed resupply, false directions, a guide leading soldiers just far enough off course to doom them without ever drawing a weapon. Death by desert does not have to come suddenly. It can come quietly over days. Thirst weakens discipline. Hunger erodes command. Panic spreads faster than reason. In such conditions, an army can collapse without ever fighting a formal battle. This leads to another uncomfortable possibility. The army may not have died together. It may have fragmented. Small groups breaking away in desperation. Officers losing control. Units scattering in search of water that never came. In this scenario, there would be no single burial site, no dramatic mass grave, just thousands of individual deaths spread across vast distances, slowly reclaimed by the desert. This kind of disappearance leaves almost nothing behind. But there is still another theory, one that challenges the entire traditional narrative. What if the army reached its destination? The Oracle of Amun was not a powerless religious curiosity. It was embedded in local power structures. Its influence extended across the region. If a Persian army truly threatened it, resistance would have been organized. Some scholars have suggested that the army may have been ambushed near Siwa Oasis itself, possibly by a coalition of local forces who understood that allowing the oracle to be destroyed would undermine their authority permanently. If that happened, the Persian defeat would not just have been military, it would have been symbolic. A god surviving a king's wrath. Such a story would have been dangerous for the Persian state. Empires depend on the appearance of inevitability, on the belief that resistance is futile. An army destroyed by rebels protecting a religious site would have inspired further uprisings across Egypt. In that context, transforming a defeat into a natural disaster makes sense. Nature cannot be punished. Nature cannot rebel. Nature does not inspire hope. A sandstorm does. And there is something else. Herodotus was writing from a distance, relying on second-hand accounts. Egyptian priests, in particular, had reasons of their own to shape the story. Blaming the desert allowed them to preserve the mystique of the oracle without openly claiming that it had defeated the Persian king. Everyone benefits from the myth, except the soldiers who disappeared. Cambyses himself would never give an explanation. His reign ended in chaos. Sources describe him growing increasingly unstable, plagued by paranoia and cruelty. He would die far from Persia, wounded and disgraced, never returning to Egypt. The empire survived him, the story did not. Over time, the sandstorm became fact. The fact became legend. The legend hardened into history. And yet the question remains unanswered. An army of 50,000 men does not simply vanish. Not without a reason. Not without leaving some trace. Not without someone, somewhere, knowing more than they ever admitted. Even today, expeditions continue to search the western desert. Occasionally, fragments surface, a piece of metal here, a human bone there, but nothing conclusive enough to settle the question. Each discovery raises hope, then fades into uncertainty. The desert keeps its secrets well. Perhaps the greatest mistake is assuming there was a single moment of destruction, a single catastrophe, a single explanation. History is rarely so clean. The lost army of Cambyses II may not be the story of men buried alive beneath sand, but of an empire stretched too far, a king who underestimated belief, and a land that resisted quietly, patiently, until the invaders were gone. Not erased, just forgotten. And that, in many ways, is the most complete disappearance of all. For a long time, the mystery of the lost army remained untouched, frozen in the form Herodotus had given it. But in the modern era, something changed. Archaeology, once focused on monuments and kings, began to turn its attention to absence, to what was missing, to what should have been there but was not. The western desert of Egypt became a testing ground for this new way of thinking. Explorers and researchers began asking a different question, not where an army might be buried, but whether it was ever buried together at all. Satellite imagery revealed ancient pathways invisible from the ground, long, faint lines stretching between oases, worn into the landscape by centuries of travel. These routes showed how movement through the desert was possible, but only under strict conditions. Deviation from them, even slightly, could be fatal. When these paths were compared with Herodotus' account, inconsistencies emerged. The distances did not align. The time frames were strained. Some of the oases he described could not have supported the number of men he claimed passed through them. This suggested that Herodotus may not have been recording a precise itinerary, but a story already shaped by retelling. And then there were the discoveries that almost fit. In the late 20th century, reports surfaced of Persian-style arrowheads and fragments of armor found deep in the desert, far from known battlefields. In some cases, human remains were reported nearby. The finds were isolated, scattered, and often poorly documented. None could be definitively tied to Cambyses' army. But taken together, they formed a pattern, not of a single disaster, but of many small endings. One particularly controversial claim came from an Italian research team that announced the discovery of remains they believed belonged to the lost army. They described bones, weapons, and signs of sudden death. The announcement drew attention, then skepticism. The evidence was incomplete. The conclusions were disputed. The desert, once again, refused to confirm the story. Yet even failed discoveries are informative. They suggest that if the army died, it did not die neatly. The desert did not swallow it whole. It consumed it slowly. There is also the question of silence. The Persian Empire was meticulous in its record-keeping. Administrative tablets survived detailing rations, troop movements, and supplies for even minor expeditions. And yet, there is no surviving Persian account of the march to Siwa or of the army's fate. This absence is striking. It suggests one of two things. Either the expedition was never formally recorded, which seems unlikely for a force of this size, or the records were deliberately omitted or destroyed. Empires do not like to document failure, especially not failure tied to divine legitimacy. Cambyses' authority rested on conquest and control. The oracle's refusal to acknowledge him struck at the core of that authority. If an army sent to destroy the oracle vanished under suspicious circumstances, it would have undermined the image of Persian invincibility. Silence, in this case, becomes a form of damage control. Over time, the empire's priorities shifted. New kings ruled. New wars demanded attention. Egypt remained difficult to govern. Rebellions flared and were suppressed. The lost army faded into the background, remembered only through foreign accounts. And foreign accounts, especially Greek ones, were never neutral. Greek writers had complex relationships with Persia. They feared it, resented it, defined themselves against it. A story about Persian arrogance punished by nature fit neatly into their worldview. The tale of a sandstorm was not just an explanation. It was a moral lesson. But history is rarely a morality play. When we strip away symbolism, what remains is a simpler, harsher reality. 50,000 men were sent into an environment that demanded humility and cooperation. They were led by a king who believed power could replace both. The desert does not reward certainty. It rewards patience, knowledge, and respect. Without those, even the largest army becomes fragile. Perhaps some soldiers died of thirst, others of heat, others in skirmishes that left no trace. Perhaps a few survived long enough to be absorbed into local communities, their identities slowly erased as generations passed. That possibility is rarely discussed, but it is not impossible. History remembers units and numbers. The desert remembers individuals, and individuals vanish easily. What makes the story endure is not the mystery of how the army died, but why we are still searching for a single answer. We want a moment, a disaster, a definitive end. But the loss of Cambyses' army may have been a process, not an event. A slow unraveling, a lesson ignored. Today, the western desert is quiet. Wind moves over dunes that have shifted countless times since Persian boots last pressed into them. The oracle at Siwa still stands, weathered but enduring. Empires have risen and fallen around it. Cambyses' II is remembered, but not as he intended. Not as a conqueror of gods, but as the king who sent an army into the desert and never saw it return. And somewhere beneath the sand, scattered across hundreds of kilometers, the truth remains incomplete, fragmented, and resistant to certainty. Just like the desert itself. There is one final angle that makes this mystery endure, long after the details of ancient politics have faded. It is not about where the army went, or even how it died. It is about why the story was allowed to remain unresolved. Uncertainty can be useful. For the Persians, a clear explanation would have forced accountability. A named enemy, a tactical failure, a weakness exposed. Leaving the fate of the army undefined allowed the empire to move on without admitting vulnerability. For the Egyptians, ambiguity preserved the power of the oracle. If the god of Amun had openly destroyed a Persian army, it would invite retaliation. If the desert had done it instead, the oracle remained untouchable, protected by implication rather than confrontation. For Greek writers, the mystery served as a warning about hubris. A foreign king enters sacred land, challenges ancient belief, and is punished not by men, but by the world itself. It was a story that reinforced how Greeks understood power, fate, and divine balance. Each group benefited from not knowing too much. And so the truth was never pursued with urgency. Even today, historians approach the lost army cautiously. Any definitive claim invites criticism. Evidence is fragmentary. Context is incomplete. The desert is vast, and excavation is expensive, dangerous, and often inconclusive. It is easier to repeat Herodotus. But repeating a story is not the same as understanding it. What we can say with confidence is this: the traditional explanation is insufficient. An army of that size disappearing without trace due solely to a sandstorm is unlikely. The logistics do not support it. The environment does not support it. History rarely supports explanations that clean. More likely is a convergence of failures, poor planning, overconfidence, local resistance, environmental pressure, a chain of small decisions that compounded until recovery was impossible. In other words, a human disaster. The men who marched westward were not legends. They were soldiers with names, routines, fears. They would have complained about the heat. They would have rationed water. They would have watched the horizon for signs of relief or threat. As conditions worsened, discipline would have cracked. Orders would have been questioned. Faith in leadership would have eroded. In such moments, armies cease to function as single entities. They become groups of individuals trying to survive. That is when history stops recording them. Because history records outcomes, not disintegration. If some of those soldiers survived longer than others, if some were taken prisoner, if some deserted or assimilated, there would be no monument to mark it, no inscription, no victory relief carved in stone. Only lives quietly absorbed into the background of the desert. And that may be why the mystery feels unsettling. There is no dramatic ending. No final scene. Just absence. The oracle at Siwa continued to operate for centuries. Alexander the Great would later journey there, seeking confirmation of his own divine status. Unlike Cambyses, he approached with reverence rather than threats. He left alive. Empires learned slowly. Cambyses did not. His army vanished, and with it, a reminder that power without understanding is fragile. That numbers mean little in environments that do not forgive mistakes, and that sometimes the greatest defeat is the one that leaves no evidence behind. The lost army of Cambyses II remains lost not because we have failed to search hard enough, but because it may never have existed in a form that could be found again. Not as a battlefield, not as a grave, but as thousands of individual stories ending quietly under the same sun. The desert did not need to bury them all at once. Time was enough.